Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
A quick note before I read the Gospel. I'm actually starting 3 verses earlier than what's in your bulletin, so you'll have to just listen for the first 3 verses, and then you can pick it up with verse 35. Beginning with verse 32. Jesus and his disciples were on the road, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 again and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him, flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do?" They said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but is for those to whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I'd like to invite the children to come forward now. You can sit right down here on the floor in front of me so I can see your faces, okay? So, when you guys are all at your house and you're having a snack and there's only one cookie left, how do you decide who gets the cookie? Oh, sometimes you split it in half, okay. Sometimes it's the one who's fastest to get to the plate. Sometimes it's the one who's the strongest. Right? So what happens like when you're at school and you want to go out to play and everybody wants to play with the kickball, but there's only 2 kickballs? How do you decide who gets the kickball? What? How do you choose that person? Yeah. See, sometimes it's the person who's the strongest or the fastest, right? Or the one who maybe is the meanest, just takes the ball. So there's lots of times in our lives where it's the fastest person who gets it, or the strongest, or the meanest, or the biggest. What you heard today in today's gospel story is that in Jesus' kingdom, things operate differently. We do things differently when Jesus is around. And when is Jesus around? All the time. And so what Jesus says is that we look out for others. And so maybe even if it's the cookie that we would like to have, we let somebody else have it. Maybe if it's the ball we would like to have, we let somebody else have it. Because in Jesus' kingdom, what makes us great is when we serve and help other people. Okay? You can go back to your seats now. I go back a long time with this story. 33 years ago, I had a class in seminary in the Gospel of Mark, and I was assigned to write an interpretive paper on this passage. Every Greek word had to be analyzed. The grammar and syntax studied. Survey of what interpreters throughout Christianity had written about the passage and how it fits in with the other stories in Mark, and on and on and on. And finally, I get to the end where I'm supposed to give my take on it. But no worries, I promise not to bore you with the 35 pages of that paper. What's interesting to me as I come back to this story over 30 years later is that as a young theologian, I don't even think I mentioned the abundant irony in this passage, but decades later now, that's what strikes me. When we take a closer look at this story, it's not just a single irony, but the story is dripping with multiple ironies. The disciples saying one thing that points to something very, very different. This morning I read those couple of verses preceding what's printed in your bulletin because they are essential to our understanding of what's going on here in the rest of the episode. James and John make this request to Jesus, this secret request apart from the other disciples, and they make a request for greatness just after Jesus has made his third and most graphic declaration of what's going to go on in Jerusalem. He keeps beating that drum. There should be no misunderstanding on the part of the disciples about what's about to happen. The religious authorities will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. Dear James and John, when you ask to sit at the right hand of Jesus in his glory, do you get what's about to happen? And don't miss this tragic irony. Indeed, there are two who will be seated at Jesus' right hand and left hand in just a few short weeks from this incident. Well, they're not exactly going to be seated next to him. They're going to be nailed to a cross and hung next to him. They will be crucified with Jesus. And don't forget, it won't be James and John, but it'll be two criminals. Dear James and John, are you sure you want to be on Jesus' right and left? And don't forget that Jesus does not want to drink this cup that he is about to drink. Remember that in the garden he will implore God, let this cup pass from me, even as he submits his will to the Father's will. But James and John, no, they insist that they want this cup. And they want this cup because they have no idea what they are asking. Jesus will share a meal, including a cup of blessing, with his disciples very soon. And then will come the other cup, the cup that he refers to, the cup of suffering, the cup that he doesn't want. When he is crucified. And then he's offered sour wine, not from a cup, but from a sponge, while he hangs on the cross. Dear James and John, is this the cup you want to drink? The first time Jesus was baptized, he was immersed in water, and then he was driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. And now comes his second baptism, a baptism of fire and suffering when he will be fully immersed in our human condition, even to death. And so be driven to the extreme of what it means to be human. Dear James and John, are you sure this is the baptism with which you want to be baptized, to be drowned in death? And finally, underscoring the manifold irony of the passage to this point, with confidence, they declare their fidelity with a confidence that is as unbounded as it is unfounded. We are able, they say to Jesus. Seriously? As the reader of this story, centuries, millennia later, We recognize all this is highly ironic because we have a better memory of what has already transpired. Remember, Peter was rebuked for at Jesus' first pronouncement of his death. The disciples' argument about who is greatest comes after his second pronouncement. John being rebuked for forbidding someone who didn't follow them from doing an exorcism. Jesus' rebuke of all of them for keeping children away from him. And we know what's coming. Peter's denial. All of the disciples' abandonment of Jesus in his greatest hour of need, which is why these ironies are as painful as they are abundant. But before we get too self-righteous or indignant, or simply compare ourselves favorably to James and John and the rest of this motley crew, we should ask ourselves whether we really do any better. Are we not similarly confident that we can follow Jesus come what may? And do we not even insist on that kind of confidence from parents and sponsors during a child's baptism? I ask you, the whole congregation, I say, do you renounce the devil and all his empty promises? And then I insist that you answer with great gusto, I renounce them. And do we not also too often assume in the secret places of our hearts that our unfaithfulness to the gospel of Jesus will lead to success? You know, maybe not the kind of wealth that the prosperity preachers offer, but a happier life than we would have without Jesus, fewer troubles and fewer heartaches, which of course, in my experience, is not always true. Are we not also tempted to assume that there is not enough to go around? And like James and John, who come to make their request from Jesus in secret apart from their brothers, that we view those whom God has given us as companions rather as competitors? Perhaps the greatest irony of this story, and indeed the irony of the whole gospel, is that even though we know it, we have heard it, I preach it, I even believe it, we still live the irony regular, the making explicit of both the pain and the poignancy of the disciples. Because to be human is to be insecure, is to be tempted again and again not to trust but to fear, to put our confidence not in God but in our own abilities, and to look out not for our neighbor but ourselves. And so Jesus says pretty much the same thing he has said over and over several times, pointing us back to a life of servanthood and service. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. Except that in Jesus' case, he doesn't just say it, he shows it, he lives it, he embodies it on the cross. Which may explain another of the great ironies of Mark's gospel. Because Jesus does indeed point to his self-emptying, not merely pronouncing his impending death, but also speaking to us of its significance. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Today in Adult Forum, in just a few minutes, we're starting a class about what the death of Jesus means for us. Now, historically, we've taken this word ransom to refer to utterly graceless atonement theories about substitution and payment and an angry bean-counting God who exacts punishment on the back of his own Son. But what if Jesus is saving us from ourselves? What if Jesus is ransoming us from the future that we think we want? From the baptism in the cup that James and John believe they need? From the glory we misunderstand? From the life we've been urged to strive after, but ultimately is not abundant life at all? A life that views companions as competitors and fellow children of God as threats. The great irony of the human condition is that when God came to us fully and completely as we are, joining God's abundant love to our mortal life, embodying God's complete acceptance and grace in human flesh, we completely misunderstood it, fled from it, were threatened by it, and ultimately we put the Word of God to death. And Jesus came anyway. And Jesus still comes. And Jesus still promises and empowers a transformation of our lives so that in Him our lives become lives shaped by our baptism and lived out in love and service. That's the life He came to bring us. The great poet Maya Angelou once remarked, "I'm working at trying to be a Christian, and that's serious business. It's not something where you think, oh, I've got it done. I did it all day, hot diggity." The truth is, all day long you try to do it, to try to be it. And then in the evening, if you're honest and have a little courage, you look at yourself and say, I only blew it 86 times today, not bad. She says, "I'm always amazed when people walk up to me and say, 'I'm a Christian.' And I think, already? You've already got it? My goodness, you're fast." Three times, Jesus tells the disciples what will happen in Jerusalem. 3 times, they misunderstand. And He goes there anyway. He keeps on marching. He keeps on walking. He keeps on healing. He keeps on loving. He keeps on serving. He keeps on giving Himself as a ransom to save us from ourselves. And He will continue to do that until all of us are saved, overwhelmed, drowned, crucified, and raised again by God's all-encompassing, unending, eternal, ever-persistent love for us